Well, welcome to this online revision session for AQA FP1, in which we will be considering the June 2011 question 8 on the topic of curve sketching. Well, the first part of this question, we're given the equation of a curve as y equals 1 over x squared minus 4, and we're asked to write down the asymptotes of the curve. So we need to consider what happens as x gets bigger and bigger, in order to determine what happens to y, and also what happens as x tends towards particular values that would make the bottom of this thing here equal to 0. It could well be helpful maybe if we factorised this expression, because we know this is the difference of two squares, so this just becomes x plus 2 and x minus 2. And so we can see that if x is 2, this bracket would be 0, or x is negative 2, this bracket would be 0, and so we'd have 1 divided by 0, which is not defined. So immediately we have two asymptotes, x equals minus 2 and x equals 2. And then we can see that if x gets very large, either positive or negative, we end up with 1 over a very large number, which gives us 0, and so y equals 0 is our asymptote for large values, either positive or negative, on our graph. So these are our three asymptotes, and obviously there is one mark for each one of those. That's the first part of the question completed. The second part then says, sketch the curve showing the coordinates of any points of intersection with the axes. Okay, well, we know we have asymptotes at negative 2, so if we draw in an asymptote at negative 2, which is where we have a break in the graph, and similarly we have one at 2. Next thing we then need to consider is what happens when x is 0, because that will give us a point of intersection on the y-axis. So when x is 0, we would get a y value of 1 over 0 minus 4, so that's negative 1/4. So we know that we have a point of intersection at this point on our graph of negative 1/4. Okay, so we clearly mark those in. Now we know that y can never be 0 because of the nature of this graph being a 1 over x squared minus 4 graph. This would never going to happen. Okay, so we can now draw in our sections of the graph. So what we need to do is just consider what happens when x is large. Well, we know that when x was large, 1 over x squared minus 4 becomes small, so we know that our graph is going to be above here and positive. We know if we put a number is slightly bigger than 2 in here, that a 2 and a bit squared minus 4 will make this positive, so this piece must be on this side. So we know our section of graph from here must come somewhere, whoops, lost control of my pen there, down through in this sort of direction. Similarly, if we look at the x being a large negative number, again x squared makes that positive, so this is above this axis. And we also know that if x is slightly smaller than negative 2, like negative 2.1, when you square it, it makes it a little bit bigger than 4, which again makes this bit positive. So this part of the graph must come down somewhere like this. Now we've got to consider what happens to the rest of the graph. We know it's never crossing this y-axis. We know this point here is the point of intersection on the y-axis. So if we put a number slightly bigger than negative 2, so that's something like negative 1.9, when we square it, that is a little bit less than 4, which means this bottom part of the function will be negative. So this part of the graph must come up from this direction. So the chances are it's going to come back down and come up from this side of the x equals 2 asymptote, and we can see if we put a number slightly smaller than 2 in, like 1.9, when it's squared it's slightly smaller than 4, so that is also coming up from the negative side here. It's not going through the y-axis that we've already established, so this must just come up, come through this point, and then come back down. And the whole of this should be symmetric based on the fact that x squared minus 4 is a symmetric function about the y-axis, because it's just the x squared graph which has been shifted down 4 units. Okay, now where do we get our 4 marks? And it's very clear as to what the examiner wants you to show when you're doing these sketches. Firstly, getting the branches generally correct. In other words, these 1, 2, 3 branches will give you 1 mark. Having this middle one coming up to an appropriate point is going to be your 2nd mark. The 3rd mark will be the fact that the branches are approaching the asymptotes. So make certain they do. Mine are a bit dodgy the way I've sketched them, but I've got an excuse with my electronic pen here. And finally, clearly showing where the graph comes up to at negative 1/4. So this point needs to be marked on there, because that is a mark that they're going to give you. And the asymptotes was the other clear thing that I said, wasn't it? Yeah. So there are your 4 marks for that part. Now in part B, they want you to solve the inequality 1 over x squared minus 4 is less than negative 2. Well, if we go back and look on our graph, less than negative 2 would be to draw a line in across from negative 2. So negative 2 is here, so we've got a line coming across at negative 2, and we want the sections of the graph which are below that line, because it's less than negative 2. So it goes from here down to this asymptote, and from a similar point here down to this asymptote. So we need to find where those 2 values are. Now we know one is positive and one's negative of a particular number by symmetry. So we need to firstly solve the equation 1 over x squared minus 4 is equal to negative 2. So that implies that 1 is equal to, multiplying by the x squared minus 4 gives you minus 2x squared plus 8. So that tells you that 2x squared is equal to 7, which is telling you that x squared is equal to 7 over 2, or 3.5, and so x is equal to the square root of 7 over 2, or the square root of 3.5. And remember, because you've square rooted, this can be positive or negative. And so if we look back at our graph again, we know that it lies there, for the solution that we're interested in is between -2 and the square root of 7 over 2, and it's between positive root 7 over 2 and positive 2. So those are the solution sets we need to state. So the solution that we're looking for is going to be -2 less than x less than negative root 7 over 2, and the other one will be root 7 over 2 less than x less than 2. For each one of these stated correctly, I'll give you 1 mark, and for obtaining this root 7 over 2, for solving this equation, in other words, that gives you your 3rd mark to that part of the question. So we use the graph to establish, firstly, the equation that we needed to solve to find the key points on the graph for the intersection that we required when y was equal to -2. And then, having established that, we then use the graph to identify the 2 key regions in which the function 1 over x squared minus 4 was less than -2. Hopefully you found that solution helpful. For more support with your maths revision, please go to the Further Maths Support Programme website.